It's 1st of June. You're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economics from DBS Group Research. I am Taimur Beg, Chief Economist. For today's podcast, we're going to go all the way to New York, where we will speak with an expert on macroeconomics, politics, and policy. Dr. Alexis Crow leads the Geopolitical Investing Practice at PwC US, helping leading corporations and asset managers to capitalize on dislocations in order to profit and expand around the globe. Alexis is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and a senior fellow at the Columbia Business School. Previously, she was managing director at New York-based G2 Investment Group. Alexis, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Taimur.
Pleasure. Hey, you're based in New York City, city that has been through a lot in recent months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And now the past several days has been characterized by street protests and mayhem over the death of George Floyd while in police custody. That was, about a week ago. So unfortunately, Alexis, we're going to start with that weighty matter. How are things there, and what's your take?
Sure. Thank you so much. And it's an honor and privilege to be with you. And it is indeed a very trying time, I think, for New York and for many cities and communities across the country in the U.S. right now. As you mentioned and indicate, here in New York, we've sort of referred in the macabre to the city as COVID headquarters, where just given the extraordinary connectivity, small landmass, and I think perhaps late actions to be able to counter the spread of the virus, we have suffered over 200,000 cases within New York City alone. In fact, there is some research by an NBER paper that demonstrates that the subway was in fact responsible for spreading the virus around in the early stages back in early March. So it's been very difficult also in a city where the city that never sleeps, but also in a city, one of the 5 major gateway cities in the US that has been responsible for a bulk of employment creation, job creation since the great financial crisis. Obviously, it's not just a financial story here and anything to do with financial services, the banks, non-bank financial institutions and asset management. Big tech have found a second home after Silicon Valley in New York City, with some of the largest FAANG companies continuing to expand their footprint here and their headcount here as well. So that combined with the artistic and cultural institutions that really make this a #1 tourism destination held into suspension. So I think it's been very, very difficult. I think it's going to be a difficult time coming out of it. And then now we have, the protests, as you indicate, and as some of the protesters are saying, some of the key sparks and fuel for fodder here are unemployment and inequality, 2 of the key issues that we have faced in the US and other advanced economies that are stagnant and deeply entrenched and that have only been exacerbated by this crisis. So it's really concerning, and our hearts and compassion go out to all of those who are impacted. And of course, I think many city authorities are concerned about a corollary spike in cases where you've seen some of the largest amount of protests.
Yeah, absolutely. Alexis, we're going to come back later and talk about income inequality, because I know it's one of your favorite topics. In fact, you wrote a really great article in the Atlantic Council last month on income inequality and life after coronavirus. So we will maybe devote the second half of the discussion to that. Let's first begin with maybe a little more conjunctural stuff about the health and economic situation. You've already touched upon the context for New York City, but let's also talk a little bit about, across the United States, your view on the easing of lockdown that's taking place.
Sure. I think, as you map out, I think, what we've faced in the US and around the world is a health crisis and an economic crisis. And I think many authorities are stepping in to try and be able to prevent a financial crisis. So with regard to the health crisis alone, I would say, Timur, we met in Singapore. I spend a lot of my time in Asia. I would say that for Asia as a whole, pandemics are relatively old news. And it's common practice to wear a mask in Japan in the best of times, right. Or to see masks, in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Pudong Airport, that's a normal business practice or tourism practice. That is completely foreign culturally to the experience in the US. And although the US also suffered from the great influenza pandemic in 1918, that was largely as a result of soldiers having contracted it. So I think now, all of a sudden, something that was culturally totally distinct from America is now hit home, quite literally. So there's been an awareness and an understanding curve that needed to hit, I think, not only with ordinary citizens, but also with their elected leaders, and really understanding the gravity of the situation. As you know, there have been this red-blue divide on reopening versus staying at home, quarantining, confining to be able to stop the spread. And sort of unsurprising at this part of juncture of deep polarization in American politics that it's taken those party lines. By and large, you would see any economist working in terms of advising governments around the world that the consensus is that to be able to increase per capita GDP is not to eliminate per capita. So I think many have said, obviously stress the importance of being able to stop the virus first to then be able to slowly reopen. And I think what we're seeing here is obviously it's a devolution of power in the way that the federal system works here, with state and municipal authorities really taking the lead, sometimes at odds with the federal government. And so I think what we certainly are seeing is huge distress in terms of fiscal balances. Many state and local governments already went into the crisis with huge balance sheet distress. And I think going forward, I think what I'm looking as I canvass leaders around the country is the ultimate health of their people is the number one prerogative. And so I think now what we're seeing is this issuing in phases of deconfinement in a way analogous to what we've seen in Italy, Germany, France, some other countries hardest hit. And that based on a number of different indicators, governments can be able to scale those back if they see a spike in cases. So I think that's working to be able to reduce some of the anxiety and uncertainty that's felt by many citizens around the country.
Right. In fact, earlier today, we did a Macro Insights live stream, and the title was Lives versus Livelihood, and you're sort of touching exactly that point. So we are seeing varying degrees of easing of the lockdown across the states. But if you wanted to fly from New York to Florida today or go from Florida to California, you could do it, right? Nobody's going to stop you.
Yeah, I think that's another key distinction that we've seen is, and some people that are, politics aside, some people that are anti-mask will say, look, you don't get a ticket for not wearing a mask. And bystanders say, well, that's not my choice. So I think you do still see, the strident liberal, roots of politics here, or almost libertarian, coming to the fore. And I think, the airlines in turn are trying to make things safer, handing out safety and hygiene kits. I do certainly see many travel related businesses trying to woo back customers with promises of increased hygiene. And so we'll see what the demand looks like over the summer.
Right. You touched upon the idea that you can do calibrated easing of the lockdown, and then if things go worse, you can scale back some of the easing. We've seen in the last 1 week, for example, in Seoul, where the moment they had a bit of a blip on the number of infection cases, they increased the stringency of the lockdown. Do you think that the state-by-state political economy is such that you can have that replicated in the US? So, for example, Florida tomorrow, if cases were to go up, would they be able to increase the stringency?
Well, I can speak from my experience in New York, and I think that many businesses, they have a very clear system online where, if you were a barbershop, you would be able to just log in, anonymously as Tamor Biggs Barbershop, but you could log in and see what phase of the business you're in and whether or not you're allowed to open. And I think many businesses are going to be concerned about the legality of the situation of whether or not they're able to open, which of course then restricts the freedom of movement that people would be able to engage in economic services. So I think that's the key the key issue. Then the question is whether you heighten policing of the beaches, the public spaces, the beaches, the parks, etc. We have seen I would say a lot more liberal ease of movement in New York than you've seen in Paris, where in Paris, of course, you had to have a slip of paper that stated why you were leaving your house and that you were only able to go within a certain very limited parameter of your house, and that you were only able to exercise outside at given times. And obviously that's very different to the experience and the Anglo-American strident individualistic cultures in the UK and the US.
Yeah, indeed. Cuts both ways. The work to develop treatment, whether it are antivirals or plasmas or better testing, as well as, of course, the big Manhattan Project of vaccines, it's going on worldwide. Lots of people, lots of money is being devoted. But at least in the US, it's largely a private sector-led initiative. You have companies like Gilead and others who are developing drugs. Once the drugs or vaccines get produced, and I'm sure they will sooner or later, would the public sector be able to make all these things available to the Americans at a nominal cost, or would people have to pay a lot of money for these things?
Well, what I would say is I think you'll see human ingenuity step in here, and some of the timelines that are provided for the vaccine, I think, can be hugely expedited when you have regulatory requirements being pared back. That's almost the genius of this. No one is immune, and it's completely democratic, and that it has to be for everyone in order for it to work. Right. So what I would say that I see promising from working with some of these companies in the private sector is the extraordinary willingness of cross-border activity to be able to produce en masse to be able to cater to the global population. So I think that's one key positive thing. I think you'll start to see, as we've seen in places like the UK and others, billions of dollars turned toward the research and development and deployment of the vaccine. So I think governments are stepping in to be able to do that. So I think in the US, it would be considered probably to be more of a humanitarian issue than it would to be an extraordinary profit-making potential, simply because that's the only way I think many households as investors and many investors and many executives as investors will regain confidence in the economic outlook in order to be able to make long-term investment decisions or able to make long-term consumption decisions. So I'm hopeful. I think if you look at you mentioned the private sector initiatives, I think I'm also hopeful at looking at the private sector's relationship with certain research groups, two of which were developing coronavirus vaccines for other coronaviruses prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, and then we're able to get the genetic sequence from the Chinese. So we're leaps and bounds ahead to be able to develop a single-strand RNA vaccine. And so I am quite hopeful, and I do think that that's the magic bullet, as you say, the Manhattan Project. What people, no pun intended, what people will really need to be able to see to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic about that, because for a while, especially with Sanofi, the whole brouhaha about how the US has taken first dibs on that, and then the French government got very assertive about it, which had sort of made everybody's fears escalate to some extent that will we see hoarding of these critical material or not. But I also agree with you that I think from a private sector perspective also, the demonstration effect would be absolutely terrible if the signal to the shareholders and stakeholders is that they are trying to maximize profit at a time like this.
Yeah, I think this is where the ESG, the social dimension, really steps in. Right.
All right, so let's talk about the bread and butter of our lives, economics. We are seeing, a procession of downward revision for the April-June quarter. I saw Atlanta Fed with a nowcast of minus 42% Q-on-Q, seasonally adjusted annualized. I'm thinking there are some investment banks who are even more dire in their forecast. But at the same time, the last couple of weeks, when we talked about banks' loan demand or when we talk about gradual opening of things here and there, it seems like, if not the entire level of the economy, but the first derivative or the second derivative, marginal improvement. So how are you looking at things? I mean, I guess we all have to sort of write off Q2, but then what's your narrative for the next few quarters?
I mean, really, is 2020 the lost year? is the way that I've been thinking about it in terms of economic activity and business. I would say that, Tay, more importantly, leading into the crisis in Q4 2019, we already saw some weak numbers, be it for governments, households, or companies. And so obviously we did see some economies being pushed into contraction, potentially, teetering on the brink of a technical recession, largely as a result of the uncertainty surrounding the US-China trade war and shutting down manufacturing in key exporting countries like South Korea, like Japan, Germany, and Italy for its own country-specific factors. Likewise, you've seen some companies, I think, grappling with a combination of the inability to regain pricing power over the consumer, as well as uncertainty surrounding the trade war, services activity slipping in some economies. So I think, when the outbreak of COVID-19 hit, obviously we were in very late cycle territory. A lot of households distressed with increasing debt service costs, notably here in the US, other places like Canada and some of the Nordics. So then, what we've seen is just this unprecedented economic stop. It's not a financial stop, it's an economic stop where all activity ceases. There is nothing counter-cyclical in the outbreak of COVID-19 because cyclical implies movement and there's no movement. So we've seen that, I think, first looking to the measures of activity with PMI and its unprecedented fall in the manufacturing side in China, also significant fall in the Caixin Services PMI. And then we've watched that, of course, ripple across the rest of the world in accordance with the virus. And so I would be one in the camp of saying it's important to be prudential about the economy. That doesn't mean being pessimistic, but certainly I think what we've seen is analogous to the Great Depression levels of unemployment, and we've seen that play out here in the unemployment figures. For my outlook for 2020 and 2021, I still see us at double-digit unemployment here in the US. So I think a recovery is going to be slow, namely because it's a stop to the whole economy, effectively. And so, as you mentioned, there are ripples of hope coming back up, percolating with the resumption of activity in some states and some sectors, construction and manufacturing being some of those deemed to be lowest risk. And obviously, we've seen a shortage in housing supply and construction workers coming into the crisis here in the US. So I think you'll see a pickup of some activity. What I am concerned about that would eventually bring markets down and prevent a V-shaped recovery that some seem to be still counting upon is that I do feel that a lot of the financial vulnerability that was also on ice coming into COVID-19 has not shaken out yet. So in the US, we have many state governments have implemented a 3-month moratorium on evictions as a result of COVID-19. So March, April, May. I think this month you will start to see some of those shake out. The delinquencies and related delinquencies also shake out. So stress for households, stress for some small to medium enterprises. We can come to the PPP stimulus in a second. I think also for some of the BBB minus rated borrowers, you have seen significant distress that has been somewhat delayed, and I think that will also eventually shake out. The Fed crucially stepping in to snap up ETFs in the high yield debt space may have provided some companies and some borrowers and some lenders with a form of assurance, but the Fed can't deliver solvency ultimately. And so I think you will see some distress shaking out, particularly as relates to sectors that were heavily levered coming in, such as the US shale oil and gas, some retail, distinguish between the haves and the have-nots in retail, as well as some non-COVID related healthcare. And obviously, the banks are in a better position than we were, largely as a result of using the architecture that was created in the wake of the great financial crisis in terms of capital requirements, Basel III implementations. So you've seen the banks be in a stronger position. Some are looking at their exposure to household debt and defaults and delinquencies, as well as their exposure to the U.S. shale oil and gas plays. So I do see some of this financial vulnerability shaking out. I think you're going to see significant stress in the private credit market here. I think a lot of the risk mentality has been herded out of the banks into some of these non-bank financial institutions, and that might work itself out. I would say coming into now, I would say Q2, Q3, where we might see a return to financial stability and economic stability coming into 2021.
Alexis, let's unpack that a little more. Coming into 2020, we had a household sector which over the last decade or so had deleveraged somewhat, so had somewhat decent balance sheet and was seeing decent job prospects and wage prospects. But then we had the corporate sector, which was drunk on liquidity and low interest rates and had got on a borrowing binge. And of course, we have seen a lot of financial engineering around share buybacks and so on. And then we had a public sector, although the cycle was strong, had actually levered up, which is normally bad practice from a public policy perspective. So now we hit this crisis, and you absolutely correctly said at the beginning that we didn't enter the crisis in the rudest and strongest of health. So now between the household, which was not super leveraged, and the corporate sector, which was high leverage, and the government sector, which was also leveraged, but perhaps has the exorbitant privilege of borrowing in dollars, so it doesn't matter. So between these three, which sector is going to lead the recovery?
Well, I mean, so firstly, I think starting with the biggest piece, which is the fiscal side of things, finally, we've seen a resumption of the fiscal sustainability debate that I think had largely gone quiet amidst the rise of MMT, modern monetary theory, effectively saying that the US borrowing is affordable and doesn't really matter. And I think you're starting to see some question the fiscal practices at the moment. So as you say, coming into the crisis, it was only really the IMF that called out this pro-cyclical fiscal expansion in the US as being a key risk on the dashboard of the global economy. Now that we've seen an unprecedented level of borrowing, a surge in spending, and a decline in receipts, I think, many point to the fact that the US can afford to do this because of its exorbitant privilege of being the world's reserve currency, fiat currency, fully tradable, and that the investor determination that the US 10-year is a safe haven has not been diminished, crucially, by a lot of the policy uncertainty that has emanated from Washington over the last 4 years, namely that in the trade war, where we still continue to see people pile into the US 10-year. So the dollar strength, I think, continues on, and the investor preference to be able to hold dollars, which then enables the U.S. to continue its borrowing, as we've seen. And the U.S. isn't exclusive there. If you look at some of the other borrowing and bond issuances, the U.K., Spain recently, I think you're also seeing very positive response on the capital markets to be able to lend to governments, particularly in non-domiciled, so foreign issuance. So investors still willing to be able to bet on governments going forward. Crucially, what we have in the U.S. is some would point to say, okay, do we have, with an inordinate increase in money supply, are we then going to come into an inflationary situation? And here I would say that in the U.S., we more risk of a deflation, where leading into the crisis, as you say, you had multi-decade lows in unemployment levels, very tight labor market, but we had wage inequality. And I would say if you look at the trend, Robert Gordon has done an exceptional job of this. If you look at the trend over the last 38 years in America, wages have been flat for the bottom 90th percentile of the income distribution.
In real terms.
In real terms. So Piketty, obviously, is another key one who, with his elephant trunk graph, demonstrates, I think, globally that the rich are, the very top 1% have gotten a lot richer. But so in real terms, the bottom 90th percentile has been struggling. And I think that explains a lot in terms of populism. You had some economists questioning whether or not the Phillips curve was dead, namely that by unemployment coming down, we weren't seeing wage inflation come up. Jerome Powell, notably in some of his Senate hearing meetings, even in the last few quarters leading into the crisis, had said, I see no heat in the labor market, and in order to justify rate rises. And this, I think he was right. So you do see distress for households. And again, I would just urge us to break it down into the quintiles, where the bottom two quintiles of the income distribution were largely getting by Groupon and credit card debt. So we reached a historic high in $14 trillion in credit card debt here in the US. Some distressed households paying between 15 to 17% interest on those credit cards. So I would say, in answer to your question, that I'm probably most concerned about some of these distressed households coming into the crisis, and we can talk about the diminishment of their purchasing power as well. For the companies, as you say, also it was this sort of halcyon moment of making hay while the sun was shining, and making hay was going out to the debt markets. And what's been extraordinary is when we saw the halt to policy normalization last year, 2018, 2019, I think what's been interesting is some of the top tier borrowers have gone out to the credit markets with overwhelming demand. So for those, I'm not really concerned about. Some of those that are obviously still in high demand throughout the coronavirus outbreak. For the others that have, I think piled on the BBB- rated debt, I think that's where I'm concerned. Janet Yellen, before she stepped down, talked about a key risk of being the deterioration of credit quality and underwriting here in the US. I think that's certainly the case. And again, I would point to the energy sector as being a key one here that we have our eyes on going forward. So, in answer to your question, I think, US government can continue to borrow because of its exorbitant privilege. It runs the risk not of inflation, but of crowding out direly needed investment spending in infrastructure, which we can come to. For the households, the distress for the bottom two quintiles, I think, is so significant and is really compounded by the outbreak. And then for the companies, the same for those that have been undergoing secular distress, as well as a combination of racking up debt coming into the crisis. I think you're going to see probably a buying moment for those that are in arbitrage and distress.
Yeah, so it has to be the government, I guess. And, I concur with you on your concern for the U.S. household, especially when you break it down along the income spectrum, because looking at it whole, I think gives a false sense of complacency. I remember we were doing this, I think, in middle of February. We were looking at U.S. auto loans and credit card loan delinquency numbers. And things were still awesome. Markets were hitting highs, and nobody thought that the coronavirus was going to be a big deal in the U.S. And they have been rising all through 2019 and early 2020. We saw a steady rise in auto and credit loan delinquencies at a time when things on paper looked perfect. So yes, there were people, despite having jobs, not good quality jobs, or even having jobs, not good wage growth, and they were struggling already. So yeah, it's not going to be the household going out and buying lots of stuff on Amazon.com. And it probably will not be the corporate sector, which is burdened with debt and maybe not feeling as optimistic. So it has to be the U.S. government. So that takes us to the fiscal measures that's been taken on so far. How would you assess? It's been pretty heroic and pretty seismic. Are you seeing it being effective?
So that's the key crucial question, I think, is, well, we've seen in terms of the stimulus or relief measures, the monetary policy side of things has been very strong insofar as, I think, as we mentioned, the ability to use some of the architecture that was created, not only for the US, but globally, such as the repo mechanisms, such as swap lines and providing dollar liquidity. So liquidity issues, I think, have been alleviated. As for the fiscal measures, I think, again, the priority has been, one, to address the health crisis immediately, and two, to address the economic crisis. For the health crisis, speaking to the case of the United States, I would say that the outbreak of COVID-19 certainly pulls the veil back on the inability of our healthcare infrastructure to be able to address this case. And I think that's been very poignant and very critically felt by those that are healthcare workers, by those that are trying to get services, and by state and local governments across the country. So that's a key one, I think, going forward. I do see the implementation of a lot of resilience now going forward, and extraordinary ingenuity on the ground, which I think will be very helpful, across even the post-COVID-19 world. In terms of the economic side, it's obviously the small to medium enterprises that have been hit hardest. And if you look at U.S. total employment, about 161 million people, so about half of the population, and what we've seen is, financial services back in 2008 and in 2018, you have basically roughly 5% of employment is financial services. 20% of total employment in the US is a conservative definition of retail and leisure and hospitality. So effectively, you've seen 20% of the labor force either laid off or temporarily furloughed. And so, that's why I think you've certainly seen the extraordinary fiscal stimulus measures that are, again, unprecedented, that have come to the fore. The disbursement of helping these small to medium enterprises through the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, although noble in intention, I think has in practice been very complex and confusing for a number of the banks, as well as for a number of the recipients. We will see how the Senate attacks this week and addresses this week. The House has just passed a motion to be able to demystify some of those measures and relax some of the measures, because it was very difficult to use loans to support employees when the employees were gaining unemployment benefits. I think many were concerned as to whether or not that would be legal or illegal. There was concern as to whether or not these were grants or whether or not these were loans. So I think if we do see, Congress and the Senate coming together, Congress, the Senate, and the House coming together to be able to demystify, that will help so many businesses. And I think many are counting on that as I canvass them around the country. I think then, of course, I think you're looking also to the uncertainty surrounding another wave of infections, which hopefully this staggered wave approach to reopening will help to cauterize some of those concerns. In terms of efficacy, I would say there's very little that a government can do to reduce the fear of someone to engage in economic interactions that's fearing for their life. So, despite all of the kind of stimulus measures, I think it's going to be difficult to see some of this just be recovered. As you say, many households can't go out to do this revenge buying that many are talking about. Even the revenge buying, quote unquote, will be tricky in an age of social distancing. So I just think we're going to see a very, very slow recovery, continued shock to demand. And for the top two quintiles of the income distribution, and namely the top quintile, I think you won't see a lot of this demand recovered. So that will just increase the savings glut of the rich. You're not going to make up the private jet trips to Aspen from the ski season in the spring. You're not going to make up some of the, the fashion trips to merchandise, which has now gone out of date because it was winter or spring clothing. You won't make up the experiential element of taking your kids, on a holiday. So I think that's going to be very tricky ground to recover.
Absolutely. So staying on this issue of with so many headwinds, what can a government do? And you delved into this issue in great depth and with particular poignance in your Atlantic Council article. And you have in mind certain projects, which may not be entirely shovel ready, to borrow a phrase from the Obama years, but are necessary. So walk us through that. Where would you like the fiscal impulse to go if it cannot turn people's attitude about consumption? People will remain a bit fearful, and there will be a lot of natural hurdles. So then how do you get the investment engine going?
Well, it's so interesting you say that, because it's like, I think there's been some debates, healthy debates, much in the way that, the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was able to look at the world and determine what might be some of the best policies. And notably, I will say, some of Singapore's fiscal measures in directly supporting workers, some of Spain's, France, Germany, I think you've seen a very positive experience of helping out with wage subsidies and furloughed workers. I think the US hopefully will come to that the next time there's a crisis and use what it's developed in this response. But I think that the question is that when you think about how much of our economic growth should come from consumption, that's a question I think that the Chinese have been openly asking. Current reading, it's about 42%. Would it ever come up to the 70% that the US currently has? And so how healthy is that anyway? As we know, if we have 70% of GDP growth coming from consumption, the single largest category year on year in terms of household spending is actually healthcare in the US. Notably, healthcare has been an outlier in terms of the stagnant sort of inflationary outlook, with healthcare and housing costs rising significantly, again, providing distress for the bottom parts of the income distribution. So when we think about consumption as driving economic growth here, again, I think part of that, if you take that healthcare component out, which has also been a number one driver of employment here in the US, things look a little bit different in terms of disposable income. As we said, disposable income significantly either put on pause and then held in savings, or degraded or eroded or destroyed by this crisis. So then where does GDP growth actually come from? And would it be healthier to have more of an investment-led economy? And by that, we look to, okay, gross fixed capital formation in the US has been on a downward trend, I would say, since the great financial crisis. Number of different reasons for that, but partly, in terms of secular decline and secular stagnation. Companies, like, let's use, a big industrial company as an example. You have some in the Eurozone, you have one here in the US. Those will not be investing in machines as much as they will be into digital technology, which is a decline in a figure of capital investment over time. But I would say that here in the US, we have gone into hyperactivity mode in financialization. So we've preferred share buybacks and dividend payouts, raising debt rather than investing our skills in technology and people. Again, some notable outliers. So we've seen this sort of downward trend on the private investment side for companies. Where might the government then step in to take on an investor mindset? And here is where I think the government in Singapore is such an interesting example, where you have, operational versus investment spending. So doing things such as to be able to support an aging population, and then you actually have the government seeding infrastructure projects, which in the end return yield, ideally return enterprise value, and also serve a social good to be able to help people and appreciate over time. And so I think that's where I would love to see the US take on more of this investment mindset. And when I've met with policy officials in Washington, we've had open debates as to whether or not, why doesn't the US become the world's largest exporter of smart cities and smart infrastructure? Some of the renewable energy innovations that were done by the US Army when it was serving in Afghanistan and couldn't get across the Fatah was extraordinary. They couldn't get their petrol across because it was getting bombed. And so you had extraordinary renewable energy innovation. That's what I would love to see. So the US taking on more of this investment mindset rather than a sort of firefighting bailout mindset, I think would be very positive. At the federal level, and thinking about this infrastructure bill that has yet to materialize, At a state and local level, I think in terms of infrastructure privatization, I think you've seen some knee-jerk reactions to things like ports with regard to national security after 9/11. I would say that we're living in a different era now. Only 1% of airports in the US are privatized versus I think it's about north of 67% in Europe that are privatized, the most privatized airport region in the world. So I would love to see more of that here. I was just speaking with an investor on Saturday who is investing in JFK, another notable private equity group investing in JFK here. So I think those would be positive things coming out of this crisis that would also lead to job creation, again, return on capital, and as well as an ability to stem some of the bleeding on the fiscal balance sheet side for state and local governments that have been tapped out in addressing the health crisis.
Alexis, when you make these points in Washington, what kind of reaction do you get?
It's interesting. The first time I brought this up, and it was actually in response to questions around the US-China relationship, and I advised a specific entity to mobilize their resources on the offensive to be an exporter of smart cities, positive infrastructure, a partner for countries around the world, not in a Belt and Road way, but just in, we do the best, almost in the way that the defense capability is sort of exported. And it was kind of met with surprise, because I think these ideas have sometimes not even been considered because of the status quo, the ancien regime. Others, I think, and then raising it about 6 months later, I've seen others positively respond to this, and you'll see that from both sides of the policy bench also suggest that. And it's met with, I think, not outright derision or negation, but I think, it will just take time, as anything does. And I think the more people that can present significant opportunities and to be able to paint accurately the profit-making potential of this, the types of human capital development that will be ultimately won, I think will be very positive over the longer term.
I particularly like the fact that you're combining issues related to privatization with the notion of exporting best practices. And this brings me to something that I heard from my friend Filippo Mauro, who teaches here in Singapore. Philip was an expert on productivity, and he pointed out that, yes, investing in research and development is very important. As a macro regularity for countries that want to have high productivity growth, they need to have investments in R&D. But if you have massive barriers to entry in a sector, all the R&D in the world still won't get you high productive returns. So making the ports, whether it's airports or seaports, private, and then allowing for greater competition and combining that with incentives toward R&D, I think is absolutely the right thing to do, not just for the US, but for the entire world. Alexis, in your Atlantic Council article, you also touched on the very important issue of the future of work. And perhaps that would be a good point for us to sort of delve into. In my view, and I'd like to hear your view on this, is that a lot of the trends that have already been in place will probably get hastened by this COVID-19 crisis. Work from home, certainly work in physical stores could be the other thing. And there certainly will be a lot of transitional costs for people and companies that have devoted lots of money in building businesses around people going to the office. And now they'll have to build businesses around people working out of home. And it may not be that seamless a transition. So tell us a little bit about your views on the future of work and the uncertainties and what policymakers need to do.
Thank you. Yes, this is a topic I'm very passionate about. And I think, firstly, what I would say, I would just kind of divide that into several buckets. One would be overall employment, and then thinking about blue-collar workers and then white-collar workers, and the skills spectrum. So just in terms of employment, we talked about some of the raw numbers. I think by and large, you and I are sitting on Skype, and I think by and large, you've seen a lot of white-collar workers be able to retain their jobs at the current moment. the blue collar side, what Miles Corex calls the foot soldiers in the COVID war, have been extraordinarily impacted. What I would say that leading into the crisis, just in terms of the automation anxiety that I hear in many boardroom discussions around the world, it's more pronounced in some countries than others. Namely, the notion that robots are coming for our jobs in this age of AI and digital revolution. What I would say is what the outbreak demonstrated is that was overblown, because we've always had successive industrial revolutions. And when we had, the obsolescence of the horse-drawn carriage as ushered in by, the Model T Ford, then you saw the jobs of the coachmen and those that were taking care of the breeding of horses, revolve into auto mechanics. So we've seen, technology replacing skills over time, and that therefore there's a new skill adaptability to be required. So when we had these unprecedented numbers of jobless claims hit, what was crucial to note is that many of those jobs are in positions that have automation immunity. So you will not be able to replace the physical capacity of someone who's taking care of security. Even coming out of this crisis, when I talk to some real estate executives, you will see an increase in demand for wellness concierge to be able to do temperature checks, to be able to navigate out of the health crisis as we return to work, quote unquote. So I think you will see demand for different types of skills. And I think those services jobs that were reliant on interpersonal and person-to-person relations will return once we have a vaccine. So that would be the first thing to point out is I think things are not as dark over the longer term as some were portraying. That being said, this crisis has, as you indicated, stimulated an overwhelming, what one economist has called a post-traumatic growth syndrome, a learning at how to create greater efficiencies under stress. And some companies in the manufacturing of consumer products space have seen that they can potentially do more productivity with less workers than coming into the crisis. So you will see, I think, some structural unemployment coming out of that. So the emphasis on retraining, reskilling, rehiring is going to be key. We've already seen that here in the US with the flexible labor market. I'm seeing many different types of workers. Obviously, Amazon has talked about keeping all of their temporary workers now on staff, even after the crisis. So I think that's important to point out, but that is something that is typical throughout our waves of industrial revolutions, and that is nothing new. The government may need to stand in to support wage subsidies if you have compression at a certain end of the spectrum, and I think that's important. On the white collar end, we mentioned this post-traumatic growth syndrome. On the white collar end too, what I have seen is an amazing agility, creativity, flexibility of people to continue to work uninterrupted. That's why I think this phrase return to work is a bit of a misleading phrase, because so many of us that have retained our employment have been able to really truly flourish. And we were laughing before we started recording about this unprecedented stop to business travel. And I think that has, in some ways, been very tough for human relationships. I'd much rather be sitting with you in Singapore right now. But I think in other ways, it's also demonstrated that we're able to continue to work via teleconferencing and Zoom and other mechanisms. So I think you've seen efficiency gains. I would say that, as you say, there's probably going to be an immense capital expenditure, not only to have addressed the outbreak-related issues of financial stability, keeping people on headcount, et cetera, amidst a decline in sales across many sectors. I think you're going to see an increase in capital expenditure in terms of sanitization, wellness, hygiene, being able to make workers feel comfortable as and when they do return, whether or not this is in waves, using digital technology to be able to help that, whether it's apps in terms of contact tracing, as PwC has developed, or whether or not that's thermal scanners to be able to check temperatures en masse. So that's in terms of the sort of professional services, financial services, resumption of activity, real estate. I would say that for a lot of other companies that are involved in moving goods around the world, that you will see a corollary increase in capital expenditure to move from supply chains from just in time to just in case. So I think you'll start to see an increase in sanitization of supply chains. But I think rather than a wholesale localization, much more of a myriad sort of diversification of logistics and supply chain just to be able to help consumers in many different locations.
Right. And that takes me to my final question. You've seen work done by Raghuram Rajan in his book, The Third Way, that seems to be something missing in terms of, the devolution of decision making and integrity of community building at the very grassroots level. We as macroeconomists sort of ignore that part. Rajan, being a macroeconomist, feels that that's the critical component of sort of revitalizing societies. Do you think at the end of this pandemic, green shoots can be seen, hopefully down the road? I mean, of course, today is the worst possible time to talk about it with all these riots going on. But we are all suffering at the same time. Surely this common experience can help people get somewhat aligned in terms of what needs to be done, whether it is this transition of jobs or the role of the public sector investment, all of those areas.
Thank you. And it's a wonderful question to end on. I would say that I'm a huge fan of Rajan's work, and I do feel as if what is encapsulated in his book is this concept of subsidiarity, namely that every part of the spectrum counts and that every part of the community counts. So it's not just, we've talked about Amazon, it's not just the big companies, that it's all the small to medium enterprises. And I think that's something that I feel, if we're even going to go down into political philosophy and actually economic history, that's something I feel that some of the communities in Europe do on a better scale than what we've done in the US and the UK, where bigger is better and the individual takes primacy. I feel as if the community building has been stronger in some places like France, Spain, Portugal, Italy. And, Rajan speaks to that in India as well, and his experience of that in India as well. So I think that is crucial, is that we recognize that bigger is not always better. And we figure out how structurally to make institutional vivification and adaptation to be able to recognize that here. And, Rajan makes the point of saying, maybe we should think about, why don't we have as many IPOs as we used to have? And part of the reason for that is if you're a small company, you're probably more likely to sell out to a larger one than you are to go public. How might we incentivize things differently? I think is going to be critical going forward. And I think subsidiarity in our work, both of us as global economists, subsidiarity doesn't just apply to the community chain within your country or your national boundary. It also applies to other countries around the world. We could spend a whole other session talking about emerging markets and fiscal sustainability after the crisis and the future of foreign direct investment, infrastructure investing, also to think about how these countries might benefit from the kinds of dialogue and relationships that we need to build. The other key aspect I think here is solidarity. And that's something that I see as I'm seeing extraordinary heartwarming moves, whether it's companies supplying people with critical PPP. Again, there's no profit there. It is only to be able to help and address gaps in supply chains. Whether or not it's people supporting their local workers. It's been unprecedented, the amount of generosity that I've seen, and I think I really hope and pray that is continued throughout and after this crisis, of thinking how can you support those around you to be able to expand their opportunity. And as you say, we're all hurting by this and bleeding by this, and whether or not it's Shiva, who is goddess of destroyer and creation. I think often it does take a forest fire to be able to create new growth. And so I am actually positive that some of these critical issues that we've discussed today will in part be alleviated by the fact that this virus has been so democratic.
That was a tour de force, Alexis. Thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you.
It's been great having you. Looking forward to sharing a real Kopi and meal with you during our next chat.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Thanks very much to our listeners. You can find all our research publications and multimedia by Googling DBS Research Library.